The book takes what I would argue is just a logical approach to understanding politics, so starting big and then focusing in increasingly. The last edition took processes first and then institutions came last, and I've actually flipped that. So I begin with a general survey of concepts, then look at democracies and authoritarian systems. Then there's a couple of chapters on how to do research in comparative politics, and one chapter which I hope will help students if they're writing research papers for their classes. And I know that my students need a lot of help with that, and I think that's probably the case in multiple different settings. Then we look at institutions, and then we look at processes. So I think there's a logic to the progression of those the chapters. But of course, different lecturers have got different ideas, and they can flip the order. But either way, each chapter is self-contained and can be used to cover in some depth each of those topics. In terms of the pedagogy of the book, I've made a number of changes, but again, I was focusing on not making too many changes because it's a tried and tested formula. But everything that you can do to guide students through the material obviously is useful for the students, and they appreciate it. So every chapter begins with a survey of the chapter and an introduction, looking at the whole chapter. The chapters are fairly consistent within themselves in terms of how I approach each of the topics. One of the things that struck me about the previous edition was I thought that more material could be presented in graphic form. And you can make some really interesting points in graphic form with graphs, tables, charts, those kinds of things. There were quite a few in the last edition, but I introduced quite a few more this time around with the idea that they could be used as discussion points in class. So that was my biggest focus there in doing those sorts of things. Also making the definitions of the concept shorter. And then at the end of every chapter, we've introduced a list of the concepts in each of those chapters. So students can literally go through chapter by chapter and they can see all of the major topics that were defined by one chapter after the other. The websites are there to guide students to new sources of information, to provide lecturers with resources. There are test banks that they can use. There are PowerPoint slides that they can use as a basis for their own presentations if they like. And essentially, just to make life easier for lecturers, that information is there for them to be able to use.